A business may sell goods or services on credit. This means it allows customers time to pay for those goods or services. You need to keep a record of each sale, showing that a value of goods or services came from sales, and that value went to accounts receivable. Accounts receivable is a collective name for all customer accounts. To record a sale transaction, you credit the sales account. This shows a value of goods or services came from sales. Next, you debit the individual customer's account. This shows the value of goods or services went to that particular customer. The debit entry also shows that the customer owes this money to the business. In time, most customers will pay what they owe. However, some won't, and their debt will be deemed as uncollectible. These debts are known as bad debts and need to be written off. One way to deal with bad debts is to wait for customers to default, then write the debt off to bad debts expenses. To do this, you credit the customer's account. This shows you've taken value from the account. Offsetting the account this way brings the account's balance to zero, thereby writing off the debt. After this, you debit the bad debts expense account. This shows you have assigned the value to bad debts, and the debt has now become one of the expenses involved in making sales. Another way to deal with bad debts is to make an allowance for them when the sales are made. In other words, you anticipate likely bad debts ahead of time. The reason you do this is to satisfy the matching principle. Sales may be made in one accounting period, but bad debts resulting from these sales will not be recognised until a later period. In accordance with the matching principle, expenses incurred should be recorded in the period revenue was earned. To do this, you begin by estimating likely bad debts. This estimation may be a certain percentage of sales. Alternatively, it can be a certain percentage of accounts receivable. To record likely bad debts, you use an allowance for doubtful debts account. This account is attached to accounts receivable. It's an asset account, but its balance isn't shown on the diagram. Only accounts receivable is shown. This is because the doubtful debts account is a contra account. Most asset accounts, including accounts receivable, balance on the debit side. Doubtful debts, to the contrary, balances on the credit side. The account is also classified as a valuation account. This is because any credit entries in doubtful debts will reduce the balance of accounts receivable. To record doubtful debts, you record the estimate with a credit entry. This shows you've effectively taken value from accounts receivable. Then you debit bad debts expense. This shows you have assigned the value as an expense. Once complete, the transaction will show that you've effectively taken value from accounts receivable and allocated it to bad debts expense. Later, some customers will default on their debt obligation. When a customer defaults, you credit the customer's account. This shows that you are taking value from their account. It also offsets the debit entry, thereby bringing the account's balance to zero and writing off the debt. Ordinarily, you would debit bad debts at this point, but you recorded the bad debts earlier when recording doubtful debts, and the bad debts will have been recognised already in a previous period. So here, all you need to do is show that the customer's debt is no longer a doubtful debt, because it has now been written off. To do this, you debit the allowance for doubtful debts account. This shows you've transferred the customer's bad debt to doubtful debts. Once updated, the doubtful debts balance will show how much debt is still doubtful. Over time, the balance of your doubtful debts account may steadily rise or fall. This will happen if your estimate for bad debts is too high or too low. To bring things into line, you will need to adjust your estimate. Doing this will result in a more accurate reflection of future bad debts expenses. As always, with this visual learning system, the credit entry is recorded first, then the debit entry. Remember it this way, then in exams, switch it around and record the debit entry first. Also, the steps involved with doubtful debts are a bit tricky to remember, but if you read this section over and over, after a while you'll just know them. You can easily do that with this online compendium. It contains exactly what you've just watched here. To learn more, go to the link in the description.